Welcome to another episode of the Young and Driven podcast. I am your host, Olivia. This is your first time listening. I want to thank you and welcome you to the podcast. This is a podcast made for creatives, made by a creative. So we're going to be talking about any and everything that we as creatives go through. So hopefully that's something you're into and you'll check out the podcast some more. But I do want to send a special thank you to all the people who have messaged me or left comments on my Instagram, letting me know how much they like the podcast, how much they've been enjoying it, the value they've been getting from that. I really appreciate that. That just makes me, want to get better. And it's also nice to know that there are people that are watching this kind of from the beginning and are eager to see my growth and my development with podcasting, as well as all the other things that you might see on my Instagram. So I really appreciate everybody that has reached out. I will say, though, one way that you can show appreciation and one way that will really help out the podcast is if you like or leave a review on whatever podcast app you're listening to this on. Or if you're watching the video on YouTube, I guess you can do the same thing. You can leave a like and a comment. But the podcast is available on pretty much every streaming platform that you can listen to podcasts on. So that's Spotify, Apple, Google, wherever. They all have their own different ways that you can show support to the podcast by liking, review, rating. And that small little thing really helps out the podcast. So I would definitely really appreciate that. But regardless, if the analytics show it or not, or if you leave a comment or not, I really do appreciate everybody that listens to the podcast and that has been checking it out. My goal with the podcast is, like I said, to help us all as creatives. So if people are getting value from it, I appreciate that. But enough about that. We'll get into today's podcast. Actually, before we get into the podcast, I just wanted to make this comment. It's kind of random, but I wanted to make it. And it's on this shirt. So I bought this shirt years ago. I don't even remember how many years ago it was, but I bought this shirt years ago. I think at like Forever 21. And has this ever happened to anyone where like you go to the store, you might buy either some shoes, a shirt, something, right? And in your head, you're like, oh, I'm gonna kill it in this. Like you have the whole outfit planned out in your head. Like you know where you're gonna wear it to, and you know how good you're gonna look, right? And then you buy the item and you get it home, and maybe there's weeks later or wherever or whenever, and you look at it and you're like, why did I buy that? Like there's never an appropriate time to wear said item or shoe or whatever it is, and so it just sits in your closet. And that's what happened to this shirt. I don't know why. I thought it was cool when I saw it, but I don't know. I did, and I never worn it. There's zebras on it. Like, I can't think of a possible place where this would be an appropriate shirt to wear. But I was like, you know what? I gotta shoot this podcast. I don't like to repeat clothes and videos I do. It's like a weird thing. Like this is like one of those creative things. If you're a content creator, sometimes you don't like to wear the same shirt in different videos, and sometimes you might shoot multiple videos in one day. These are just like little things that if you're a creative, you can relate to. But I was like, you know what? I feel like shooting this podcast, or I have to shoot this podcast. I walked past my closet, saw this shirt, and I was like, this is the perfect time, right? This is when I'm going to wear it. But yeah, let me know in the comments, has that happened to anybody else? Have you bought something and at one point in time thought, oh yeah, I'm going to kill it in this, and then that item just sits in your closet and you never worn it? Let me know. I need to know that I'm not alone in this. But anyway, let's get into today's episode. So if you're new to the podcast, I like to start off with a segment called the quote of the week. And the quote of the week is basically a quote that I found that was either inspiring to me, and it usually always leads into my main topic of the episode. So this week's quote is a quote by Thomas Edison, and I have it on my computer, so I'm going to read it here. Normally I have it on my phone, but the quote is, "Many of life's failures are people who did not realize how close they were to success when they gave up." And that kind of brought me into today's main topic of this episode, which is creating your story. and turning what you might currently see as a handicap, something that's holding you back, into viewing it as something that's actually just going to make your success story that much sweeter. I know it's so easy with social media to kind of compare yourself to others, see where you're at career wise compared to them, see what you're good at, see what you don't have compared to others. And it's so easy to beat up on yourself and start seeing certain things, like I said, as handicaps. Maybe you feel like you're a producer that doesn't make enough beats, or you're a person that you're not a strong writer, but you want to write a book or a TV show, and just whatever little things you might currently view in your career or in your life as handicaps, and instead look at these as great moments that you're going to tell one day when you're telling your success story. It's almost like a movie, right? The reason why we like a good happy ending in a movie is because we saw all the things that the protagonist went through. The more conflict there is, the more struggle that the main character goes through, it just makes that ending way more satisfying, right? If there was nothing that ever went wrong, that would be a boring movie. And that's kind of like life, right? You don't want a boring life. So like I said, anything that you might currently be looking at as a handicap in your life, really start changing the way you see it, right? If you are someone that sees yourself as being successful, right? When you envision yourself finally successful, whatever that looks like for you, when you're telling the story, right? When you're thinking back from where you were comparing to where you are now, when you tell the story, don't you want some exciting things, right? You don't want a boring story, right? It's going to sound so amazing when you tell everybody all the things that you overcame to get where you're at, right? And I feel like having that kind of mental switch of looking at your problems, not as handicaps, but just as like great moments in your story, having that mental switch will really excel you, because when you can go through things, and we as creatives, but just especially as people, we all go through our different hardships and our own different experience. So when you can go through things and not feel bad about it, kind of just accept where you are in life, accept where you are, wherever in your career, that's when you finally will break through. When you're not fighting and feeling bad, if you're not, on the same level as someone else, that's when I believe you'll finally excel. So having that mental switch of seeing your issues or your problems as just great moments in your story is really gonna propel you. And I feel like a perfect example of this is looking at someone like Maya Angelou. And if you don't know who Maya Angelou is, I definitely recommend you looking her up, really looking into her story. It's super inspiring. But Maya Angelou, she did a lot. She wrote a lot of books. She was a poet. She was a singer. She was a civil rights activist. She did a lot. But at one point in time, she was actually mute, right? I believe for like 5 years, when she was a child, she didn't speak, right? There was a traumatic experience that happened, and it caused her not to speak. And then a few years later, after she did begin to speak and everything like that, I believe she had a child early, and she was a prostitute at one point, right? She had to, do what she had to do. And I'm bringing up all these things to say that I'm pretty sure at one point in time, these were things that probably brought, shame to her. She was probably embarrassed about her being a child that was mute and timid. Like, people probably didn't expect much of her, but she was still able to go on regardless of all these things happening to her, and regardless of what people might have thought of her, was able to go on and do so many great things, right? Like I said, if you don't know who Maya Angelou is, definitely look her up. I'm kind of skimming through her story, but the point is, she went through a lot and experienced a lot. And instead of these things holding her back, they ended up just making her story that much more great, right? Knowing that she overcame so many things and experienced so much just makes her story that much more inspiring to everybody else. And you could possibly even say the same about artists like Stevie Wonder or Ray Charles, right? The fact that they have a physical handicap that they overcame and were able to still make great, amazing music. Like, they're huge musicians and they can't see, right? That just makes their story that much sweeter. And I really believe that, like, if you really start looking at the things that you might currently be going through or whatever it is, start really looking at your struggle as turning that into your story, and realize that you're going to be able to look back one day and see, where you came from and all the things that you went through. And it's just going to make for an amazing story that you're going to one day tell. It's funny, my mom used to joke all the time, when I was a kid, anytime she did something I didn't like or I felt she was being unfair and I would complain, like most young kids would do, she would always say, oh, well, you're just going to put this in your book. This is just another thing to add to your book. And it was funny, but that's kind of true. Like, you have to look at life and the things that you go through as just moments, just scenes that are going to be a part of your story. So don't look at whatever you're going through as something that's going to hold you back. Look at it as something that's going to make your movie, your story, that much greater. All right, so before we get out of here, I'd like to close the podcast off with the last segment. And if you're new, the last segment is the question of the week. The question of the week is basically just a random question that I want to ask. Sometimes it's a thought-provoking question meant to spark some inspiration and get you thinking. And sometimes it's just a funny, cool question. And that's what today's question is. And the question is, if you had to go on a long road trip, which celebrity do you think would be the funnest to go on the road trip with, right? It's just going to be you and that one other celebrity. And you have to think, right? You have to pick somebody who you think music taste y'all to like, because if you're on a road trip and when you're passing back and forth the aux, you want to make sure that you're both playing music that you both enjoy. And then the second part is, if you're on a long road trip, one of probably the best things, if you pick the right person to go on a road trip with, is having, random, long, deep conversations. So you got to pick somebody who you can have good conversation with. So which celebrity do you guys think would be a great person to go on a road trip with? For me, I would say my celebrity of choice would be probably Rihanna. Obviously, we're not going to have a problem with the music, so that would be fine. But I don't know, I think Rihanna's just a cool person. I think we would have a great conversation. We maybe even smoke on the road trip. I think me and Rihanna would have a great time. But I'm curious, what celebrity do you think would be a great person to go on a road trip? Let me know in the comments if you're watching this on YouTube, or if you're listening to this on traditional podcast apps and you want to let me know your answer, you can go ahead and message me on my Instagram at YoungandDriven. But that's all I have for today's episode. Hopefully you really enjoyed it. Once again, I thank you for all the first-time listeners and my returning listeners. If you like the podcast, please, like I said earlier, go ahead and like, review, subscribe to wherever you're listening to this at, and I will talk to you guys in the next episode.
Young and Driven.